Then the rebellion. On January 24, 1708, William Hallett III, his wife Ruth, and their 5 children were murdered by 2 people they enslaved, Sawney, or Sam, and an unnamed black woman. Details are provided in a letter from the Reverend William Urquhart of the Church of England in Jamaica, Long Island, written about 2 weeks after the rebellion. The letter is addressed to the Secretary of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, one William Hallett, Jr., who lived at a place called Hellgate. It has the name from the difficulty of vessels passing up and down the river. The husband, the wife, and 5 children in less than quarter of an hour were murdered by one Indian slave whom he had nursed up from 4 years old. There was a Negro woman slave in the house who was abetting to him in counseling and persuading him to this bloody murder, but he confessed the hands murdered them all after this manner. William Hallett and his wife had been at Justice Hallett's house, the father of the said William Jr., with some others of their friends. About 7 at night he came to his house, and his wife, being weary, went to bed, and all the children. The husband sat in the chimney corner, sleeping, as his custom was. The slaves were watching their opportunity, for they were resolved to do it that night. And the house being something dark, Sawney, for so is the Indian slave's name called, came into the house, and had an axe laid behind the door, and seeing his master asleep, took the axe and struck him first with the edge and then with the back on the head. The first stroke waked his wife, who was abed in the same room, and she called murder, whereupon he left him and struck her with the back of the axe on the head. There was one child lying by the mother, who did not awake as yet, and there were 2 lying in a trunkle bed, about 7 or 8 years of age. Those he murdered next, and all with the back of the axe on the head. Then he dragged the young child out from its murdered mother, and knocked it on the head. Then went above stairs, and murdered the 2 children that were there. This he confessed, and that there were some others that knew of the murder. The Negro woman confessed the same. My Lord Cornbury issued out a special commission of Oyer and Terminer to Chief Justice Mompesson, Judge Millward, Colonel Willett, and some others for their trial. Monday last, being the 2nd of this month, the Indian man was hanged and hung up in chains. The Negro woman was burnt alive. The court is adjourned till next week in hopes for further discovery. There are now in custody upon suspicion 4 Negro men and 2 Indians, all slaves, not natives here. We know that of these additional unnamed enslaved people arrested, 2 were considered their accomplices who have been tried, condemned, and executed, as Lord Cornbury wrote shortly afterwards. The Boston Newsletter of February 9, 1708, includes the detail that Ruth was pregnant at the time of the murder, and that they committed this murder because they were restrained from going abroad on the Sabbath days. While this was no doubt a tiny part of the inhumanity these people suffered in the condition of slavery, it is richly ironic that William Hallett I is persecuted fighting for his right to practice religion. His grandson and granddaughter are persecuted fighting for their right to practice religion, and they are then murdered in part for persecuting people fighting to practice their religion. These 1708 murders and rebellion were taking place as white supremacy was ascending in the colonies, and enslaved people were realizing that even the culture's sacred religion provided no outlet for freedom. The only missionaries that bothered with black people in New York City was the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, and even then it was just one guy who cared and did the work, named Elias New, who administered to black people and taught basic scripture reading skills. The physical area within which New York slaves could sustain family life consisted of sleeping space in attics and cellars, rooms in the kitchen area of the dwelling, or in small separate outbuildings. Such shelter was generally overcrowded, offered small protection against weather and disease, and provided little privacy from both white scrutiny and other slaves. a small windowless stone-walled building, which tradition tells us was used as a slave house, stood near the Jan Beebe House, built by Daniel James van Antwerpen in the 1670s. In 1713, Reverend John Sharp inadvertently provided information on slave housing in his comments on Elias New's religious work among the Negroes in New York City. They see him creeping into garrets, cellars, and other nauseous places to exhort and pray by the poor slaves when they are sick. And even the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel had backed with their powerful sway a law in 1706 that stated that baptism into Christianity would not alter an enslaved person's status as a slave. While slavery was not unique to the United States, there being no way out of slavery, even by joining the dominant culture, was new to people from cultures in Africa or even in ancient Rome, where slavery was not necessarily a life sentence. Both of the enslaved people were executed for their rebellion, but the man was hung and woman was burned. Scholar Rebecca Hall explains that, according to a statute promulgated by King Edward in 1352, a woman who killed her husband or master had to be burned at the stake, because the killing was not defined as murder, but rather as treason against the state. This was because a woman's husband and or master was considered her natural lord, and killing him was analogous to killing the monarch. Conversely, when a man killed his wife, the killing was categorized as murder, and hanging was the required punishment. In fact, this statute forbade the burning of men unless they were witches or heretics. We point out that it would be this very pattern in law that might have caused William Hallett and Elizabeth Winthrop Feeks Hallett to be convicted as heretics back in 1656, as the authorities no doubt believed they were. These two enslaved people, Sam and the black woman, were not just executed, they were tortured in unique ways. We are told that they were put to all torments possible for a terror to others. Then, water in a horn fastened to a pole was reached to their mouths to allay their thirst and so prolong their sufferings. Afterwards, authorities swarmed to repress enslaved people evermore with an act for preventing the conspiracy of slaves in October of the same year, which provided the death penalty for murder or attempted murder by an enslaved person. This is referred to as an upshot of the murders in 1935 by scholar Samuel McKee. Perhaps not coincidence, also in 1708, the citizens of Queens petitioned the General Assembly for the enactment of a law to repair or build anew the County Hall, as it was then called, and the common jail. 83 years after the 1708 rebellion that killed William Hallett III and his family, William Hallett III's nephew, Jonah Hallett, was sheriff and was paid £11 for executing a wench, Nellie, and whipping sundry persons.